Hello, friends. Welcome to Experience Data Talk, a show featuring data science leaders and technologists from around the world. My name is Mike Delgado, and this is episode number 118. Today, we're chatting with Dr. Edward Ashford Lee about his latest book called The Co-Evolution, The Entwined Futures of Humans and Machines, which just published last week from MIT Press. Dr. Lee is Distinguished Professor in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the University of California, Berkeley, where he runs the research center focused on industrial cyber-physical systems. We recorded this show right after we were all asked to stay home due to COVID-19, so this episode begins with us chatting about how this pandemic impacted Dr. Lee and his family. Here's our conversation. So this is a special Data Talk edition, the home edition, because of everything going on. A lot of us are working remotely, and I want to thank Dr. Lee for being our guest today. Thank you, Dr. Lee, for being on Data Talk.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for organizing this.
Dr. Lee, I was wondering, before we begin, if you can share a little bit about how the coronavirus pandemic has impacted you.
Well, I was on sabbatical in France and traveling around in Europe this spring and was scheduled to be there through April with my wife, who is also a professor at Berkeley. Needless to say, things got kind of disrupted. In fact, it was when Trump announced that he was canceling all travel from Europe that we went into a panic and decided that we had to come back immediately and scrambled to get flight reservations before his Friday deadline, which was ambiguous about when that was actually going to be. Was Friday? Was it Friday at 12:01 a.m. or Friday at 12 midnight? So it was a bit of chaos, and we were both scattered in Europe. I was in Stockholm, and Rhonda was in Amsterdam. And I initially got us flights just going directly back from those places and abandoning all of our stuff in the apartment in Paris. But then when I found out that it was Friday midnight, I realized I had time to go to Paris to collect our stuff and then fly back. And so anyway, we found ourselves back here sort of unexpectedly. And then our daughter got booted out of her college dormitory.
Wow. Just crazy. I mean, being overseas, traveling, and then hearing these different timelines and when you need to get back to the States, and your wife's in a different country entirely. How did you kind of manage like your own kind of emotions during that period?
Well, it was very stressful. It's actually, in a way, there was had a certain amount of luck because my daughter accidentally called me at 2:30 in the morning. She didn't, intend to call me and just, apologized. Oh, Dad, I'm sorry. Go back to sleep. And then my other daughter texted me telling me what was going on because she had just heard Trump's announcement. And so I was able to go online right away and get the plane tickets that I needed before, the chaos really kicked in.
How have you been? Because I know the hard thing right now is just staying connected with family and friends. Like we just can't see them in person like we normally do, or even work with our colleagues because a lot of us are working remotely, and some of us need to be staying in our homes depending on where we live. And I'm curious about how are you kind of maintaining or even nurturing relationships with those you care about?
It's a challenge. I think that the technology helps a lot, like the technology that we're using for this. My mom is well into her 80s and is living right near us here, but the facility that she's living in is on complete lockdown. They are not allowing visitors in or out or people in or out. So I've been FaceTiming with her as often as possible, and that helps to maintain a connection. I think with my colleagues and people that I work with, to some degree, we're very much used to collaborating remotely because we tend to be very mobile. In my profession, we're always traveling all over the world, and so often my graduate students don't even know where on the planet I am, and we're kind of used to that. I've had graduate students send me email, you mind if we meet this afternoon? And I say, well, I'm in Beijing, so it's not going to happen. So to some degree, we're sort of used to leveraging the technology that way, and I think it really actually helps a lot. There's been a very significant uptick of just email exchanges among my colleagues. I think it's essential, really, to help maintain a sense of community. Imagine if we were all isolated without having this connectivity, that sense of community could evaporate very quickly.
I think what's cool is that you have already been adjusted to working remotely. You've been, traveling. You are, um, as a teacher and communicating with your students through email, like it's something that you're already used to. But for a lot of people who are immediately being told you need to work from home, and now um, everyone's trying to just figure out like what does that look like? How do I maintain kind of a work-life balance? And when am I actually working? When am I actually living my life outside of work? I'm kind of curious, like how you have managed to kind of separate those things.
Well, to some degree, my work is so tightly integrated with my life and always has been,
Mm.
that it's really in that respect not that different. Um, I think, if anything, you know, it's easier for me to work now because there's fewer interruptions. It's something that I'm fairly used to. It's, I think, extremely difficult for students at the university, and I'm seeing the other side of it with my daughter, who's gotten booted out of her dorm in college, and has perhaps the weirdest freshman year on record.
Mm.
Um, and she's really struggling with this, and trying to work on courses that are designed around group lab projects and things like that are extremely difficult to reorganize. And I'm very glad that I'm not teaching this semester. I think it would be extremely difficult, and I see my colleagues at Berkeley struggling with this. And I really feel for the students. This is yeah, extremely stressful for them. I mean, being an engineering student in college is stressful enough as it is, and this has really thrown a monkey wrench into their lives.
And in the midst of all this, you are about to have your book published called The Co-Evolution: The Entwined Futures of Humans and Machines. How has the coronavirus impacted like the book launch? And I'm just kind of curious about from your perspective, has there been any changes to your scheduling and things you're planning to do around the book?
Um, not not really much in the way of changes in schedule. I mean, um, I have several speaking engagements lined up that are likely to be canceled. Um, that's Some of them, may be held remotely. I think that sometimes, the remote, um, an attempt to recreate the experience of a conference remotely, our technology really isn't good enough for it yet. So I was very much looking forward, for example, to a workshop that is scheduled to happen in mid-May in Vienna, that is focused on the topic of digital humanism. And it's an incredible group of people that have been invited to this workshop, and I was invited to give a talk that would be in part centered around my new book. And I was really looking forward to it. And they're talking about still holding it, through teleconferencing technology. But the reality is that I've participated in a few meetings like that, and my experience is that when I meet people for the first time through teleconference, I usually don't remember them for very long.
Hmm.
They just sort of go out of my mind after the meeting. It's very different from an in-person meeting, and I feel like we don't we haven't really gotten the technology quite there to be able to get close enough to that experience of an in-person meeting. Um, Maybe we'll eventually get there, but I don't know exactly how. But we're not there yet.
That's really interesting perspective. I haven't really thought too much about, like, I guess meeting new people through a webinar format, and then not remembering them as well, because having that personal touch, like seeing them in person, um, being able to maybe shake a hand. Um, I guess there tends to be like a more of a connection when you're there in person versus video.
Right. Yeah. One of the themes in my book that I devote a couple of chapters to is looking at this question of cognition from the perspective of whether machines can or will ever acquire a cognitive being. And one of the topics that I look at in quite a bit of depth in the book is a thesis that has become fairly popular in psychology recently that's called embodied cognition, which really says that our cognitive selves are in fact not something that resides inside the head and the brain, sort of looking out at the world and responding to stimulus and reacting to it, but rather that our cognitive being is the interaction of our brains with the world around it. That without that interaction, there really isn't a cognitive being, and and a cognitive being can't develop without that interaction. And I think that one of the problems with the webinar format and any kind of remote interaction technology is that it doesn't have the bandwidth. The interaction, the level of interaction is really drastically reduced. Even with high quality video, it's a much reduced manner of interaction, and I think that it can't really replicate the in person experience.
That's really that's really interesting. I've never really thought about um, how we connect with others through in person versus phone call, text, right? Like I see like in person obviously is the best way I think to connect with somebody. You can easily see nonverbal language, being able to touch, hug, like that connection is like the most intimate. And then from there, it's like, I guess the next thing is like I guess a video type chat is where you can actually kind of still get verbal cues, but it is more not as intimate. It's more distant. And then uh, maybe a step down from that would be like a phone call where you hear their voices, but it's still there's a further disconnect. And then maybe like a handwritten letter or an email. But I think a handwritten letter is even more personal because you can actually see the way the person wrote the letter, the words. But it's kind of interesting because I never really thought too much about like how these different methods connect us, but how the in person is probably the most effective, the most intimate.
Yeah, I think that today the machines are largely limited to digital interactions, and I think that in the physical world we don't really have that limitation. So there's many nuances about interaction and feedback effects, right? When you're when you're interacting with someone, it's not it's it's not like just a stream of data in to your brain and a stream of data out to the other person. It's much more of a feedback loop that what you say, what you think, how you feel um, is tightly intertwined with that other person. It, how they react to what you're saying changes what you say, how you say it, what you're thinking, and that feedback loop is just not as effective when it's mediated through the delays, the limited resolution, the fact that it's only using some of our senses. Um, it's a much restricted kind of interaction.
Can you talk more about this idea of cognition and AI? Because the way that you were defining it earlier was really interesting to me about you need to have some sort of um, transmission. There needs to be another thing there to transmit and have feedback back and forth. Like that's necessary for cognition. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I think that the revolution that we've seen in AI in the last 10 years has been uh, primarily a consequence of the introduction of feedback into the algorithms that are used in AI. So, um, machine learning technologies are essentially a feedback system where the machine's parameters are getting adjusted on the fly iteratively in this iterative process through interaction with its environment. So the AIs at Google that govern the search engine, for example, um, are constantly tuning themselves in response to the searches and the clicks that people do in response to the searches, right? So there's that feedback mechanism, and that is in notable contrast to what people call the good old-fashioned AI strategy, which had this idea that you could somehow come up with the algorithms of cognition and then encode those into a computer, and you would have something that resembled a cognitive being. And that's quite different from the feedback loop, and it's a much more classical kind of computational system, where a computational system is something that you've got you've got the data available to it. It does its cranking and gives you outputs, right? That's what we mean by a computational system, whereas a feedback system is actually interacting with its environment. And I think that this revolution in AI is in part driven by software that is much more interactive with its environment. I think that in some ways, this is starting to resemble the kind of interactions that we see in biological beings. So, one of my favorite examples that I talk a little bit about this in the book, but there's an important mechanism in many living creatures, not all, but certainly all animals, in having an ability to distinguish self from non-self. And there's very good reasons why this is valuable, right? So if you have, think of a relatively simple nervous system in a worm. The worm has sensors that, sense the friction of the worm against the surface that it's on. But the worm's nervous system can tell the difference between friction that is caused by the worm's own motion versus friction that is caused by some external thing that the worm has no control over. Right? So the worm will react to some motion of the surface below it by curling up, for example, if it was not the cause of that shifting. But
Oh wow!
But
That's
if, on the
interesting.
other hand, it was its own making its own motion, the sensory organs are giving it the same stimulus, but it doesn't react to that stimulus in the same way. And so, even a very simple nervous system like a worm, through a feedback mechanism, can distinguish self from non-self. And so that's the beginnings of in my view, it's the beginnings of cognition, is this ability to distinguish self from non-self. It's a very primitive form in a worm, but it gets much more sophisticated in higher animals and of course in humans. And I think the machines are only just starting to acquire that, because they're really only just starting to deeply engage in interaction with their environment.
That's fascinating because I never really think about a worm as having any sort of cognition. But I guess if you're saying and just talking about just like the feedback and being able to detect itself versus its surroundings, and a worm like curling up in the sun, all of a sudden it detects this heat and it's beginning to shrivel. That something interesting is happening there, and we can begin to see like I guess signs of cognition and like very in the infancy stages.
One of the things that's required for that to actually work is, as I keep saying, it has to be a feedback mechanism, which means that the system in question has to affect its environment and also sense its environment. It's not enough to just sense the environment. You have to actually be able to affect the environment. So one of the examples that I use in the book to illustrate that this is already happening in machines is in software that is heavily engaged with human interaction, like Facebook, for example. The way that humans interact with the software is very much affected by the details of the layout of the interface that gets presented on screen to the humans. And rather than just design that open loop, the software at Facebook will run essentially controlled experiments where it'll synthesize variations of the user interface and try them out on different groups of people. So it'll have a control group where it uses the old design, and then a new group where it uses the new design. And the new design is just a tweak on the old design. So it's like a little Darwinian mutation on the old design. And if the humans react in a positive way from the perspective of the Facebook software, which usually means they click on more ads, then the user interface, it effectively redesigns itself and acquires that new interface. Okay, so the software itself is performing randomized mutations, trying them out in the ecosystem, and the ones that survive are the ones that trigger more effective behavior from the software from whatever perspective. In this case, the reward function is clicking on ads, and then the software evolves to adjust itself and to be more effective in getting the humans to do what it wants them to do effectively. So that's a feedback mechanism. The other thing is that feedback mechanism actually gets deeper because the software tools like Facebook are not just used by users, by humans, but humans are actually changed by those interfaces. My colleague at Berkeley, Stuart Russell, recently published a book called Human Compatible that is a really wonderful read, where one of the points that he emphasizes in this book is that these AI systems are not only trying to optimize themselves to get you to click on more ads, but in effect, because of this feedback mechanism, they're feeding you information that will tend to change you in such a way as to get you to click on more ads. So one of the things that we see, for example, is that online communities that form in the Facebook context have a tendency to move towards extreme political positions. And Stuart Russell's hypothesis about this is that part of the reason is that the software is trying to predict human behavior, and humans are more predictable if they're more extreme. Okay, so in effect, there's this feedback mechanism naturally leads to the software feeding humans information that will tend to make them more extreme because it'll make them more predictable, and it's trying to optimize that predictability. So it's these kinds of feedback mechanisms that I think are kind of central to what's going on.
I heard an example where, and you may have seen it in the news, where these AIs were at Facebook were sharing. I'm not sure what the situation was, but basically they were sharing information back and forth to each other to inform each other about something, and they began to develop their own language to be more efficient. Did you happen to see that story? And I'm wondering, is that an example of like a cognition, like a feedback, like the AIs are trying to help each other with some data points?
Yeah, I actually write about an experiment in my book that was like that. It was trying to, as I recall, it was trying to get software to learn to negotiate. And what they did was they pitted two of these AIs against each other to learn to negotiate with each other. And the AIs effectively developed a language, a kind of a mysterious language with lots of weird incantations that nonetheless would lead to effective conclusions to the negotiation. But it was, they started out with human language, and it quickly diverged from anything that humans would recognize. I think that that's you know an example of kind of a rapid evolution that can happen in a closed ecosystem. Um, and I think it's also, it's just an acceleration of what happens with human language. Human natural languages are constantly changing. It's not surprising to see, effectively new languages evolving when you have kind of a closed ecosystem like this that's designed to mutate rather quickly.
Those are examples of where AI has done something unpredictable and seemingly, obviously, out of our control. It did something that we did not expect. And I think those are some of the examples that kind of make us sometimes fearful about the future of AI. And I was wondering, maybe you can talk to like kind of that feeling of the lack of control and where AI is headed.
So, yeah, one of the themes that I develop in my book is that you know, I'm I've worked in engineering and computer science for 40 years, and um, for most of those 40 years, I harbored what I now recognize as an illusion that um, when we create a technological artifact, that 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 the result, the product that we produce, is the result of human cognitive decision making. In fact, I coined the term digital creationism in my book
Hmm.
for this idea that these technological artifacts are things that we have designed through a top down, intelligent design, deliberative process. Um, I now realize that's actually not true.
Hmm.
And it's particularly not true of complex software systems because the engineers that are involved, they first of all, they never start with, just a blank text editor and start writing code. That's not the way it happens, right? The way you build software is you take pieces of software from here, pieces of software from there, and you combine them. And you stitch pieces of software together to, in effect, create a mutant of
Hmm.
those original pieces of software. You can think of the code that you're working with as almost like the genetic material in
Hmm.
that software. I call it the codome in my book. And the software engineer is kind of the agent of mutation in this process, and they create this mutant. And most of these mutants die out, but a few of them survive. And the reason that they survive is often inexplicable. So we tend to think, for example, that, well, all right, so the people who designed Instagram must have been really good software engineers because it took off and was very successful in the marketplace. But really, no. Actually, there were thousands of, very similar kind of mechanisms that lots of people were experimenting with, and most of those mutants simply died out. And the ones that survived for very complex reasons that are often, in retrospect, very difficult to discern. And so they're not. It's hard to explain this process as the result of top-down deliberative design.
Hmm.
It's really much more like a Darwinian evolution. So if you accept that perspective, then the reality is that we never were in control. And so when people talk about fearing, that we're going to lose control of the development of AIs, well, I have to say we're not going to lose control because you can't lose something you never had.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so if you understand that this process is kind of co-evolving, it's a co-evolution, not just an evolution, right? It's not just software mutating and then facing a survival of the fittest kind of Darwinian selection process. It's more complex than that because the humans involved in this process are changing as well. I write a lot of software myself. I have for my entire career. I mean, I've been writing software since the mid 1970s, and I use a lot of software tools. And I've come to realize that the languages, the programming languages, and the tools that I use very, very strongly affect my thinking. That they've changed my brain, my way of thinking, and they strongly affect what I do with the software. And so the software has changed me, and then I'm changing the software, and so there's
Mm,
mutation occurring on both sides of the
mm.
stream and interacting with each other. Okay, and that coevolutionary process is really what's driving the development of software more than this sort of classical view of top-down intelligent design of these engineered artifacts.
Can you share an example of what you just said about you are being changed by the software, and then you're now adding changes to the software, and kind of that feedback loop going back and forth between the software, you, and back to the software?
Yeah, I'll give you a concrete example. I mean, so when I'm writing software, I often, you know, I'll uh, I'll realize that okay, there's something I need to do here. I need to be able to index this data in this particular way, right? And I'm not sure how to do that, so I fire up Google and I try to come up with the best English language sentence for what I'd like to do that I can come up with, and I get a few hits, and it takes me to say a page on Stack Overflow, which is a kind of chat room for software geeks. And Stack Overflow is a fabulous resource for software engineers because there's a lot of wisdom there and a lot of solutions to puzzling problems
Mhm.
that people have struggled with for decades often. But it used to be that every software engineer had to solve these problems independently. Whereas now you can, with the help of these search engines and these chat rooms, actually go and find a solution that came out of someone else's head and you go ahead and use that solution in your software. Okay, so it gives you this mechanism that enables you to produce software. I would say, my own personal productivity writing software has got to be 20 times higher now than
Mm.
it was 20 years ago. I, I can write software that, 20 times faster. Um, it's and much more sophisticated software because I'm able to use much higher level tools. The software tools that I use to write software give me instant feedback. When I make an error in my typing, it's not just like it's sort of like a very sophisticated spell checker, right? The computer is telling you what you're doing wrong, and the computer is in effect guiding you, and it's guiding you with a backdrop of these AI algorithms that are going to guide you in ways that are governed by whatever learning has been built into those AI algorithms, which is affected very much then by what the other users have done, right? So that fact that the machine is guiding the production of software and the software engineer is, also guiding the process, but
Mm.
there's this feedback loop that's happening.
Mm. That's cool. How do you see things progressing? Like, how do you think software engineering and the work you're doing will change in the next 5 to 10 years?
Um, well, I think that in some ways the trajectory has been that creating much more sophisticated pieces of software just keeps getting easier, right? Integrating sophisticated algorithms, integrating machine learning into applications is just infinitely easier than it was, just a few years ago. And I think a result of that is that we're building much more complex software, and I think the complexity often comes with surprises, right? It'll exhibit behaviors that we didn't really expect, and many of those will not be useful. Um, some of them may even be destructive. There will be side effects that come out of the software that succeeds. I mean, I think to some degree, we can see, you know, election interference as a side effect of this kind of process, right? I
Hmm.
don't think, it's easy to just vilify the engineers at Facebook and say, they were evil. They just were driven by the profit motive, and they you know, did bad stuff that led to a dismantling of democracy. But that's not really a very accurate description of what happened. I think they were just as surprised as anybody by this outcome, and they certainly didn't plan this to happen. And so the software develops behaviors that surprise even the designers, and the iterative process of refinement of the software gives us much less control over that trajectory than we think. So many people, for example, they like to oversimplify the problem and say, well, if we weren't just all greedy capitalists trying to make money, then we wouldn't have these kinds of problems. But there's another way to think about this that's a little bit less value laden, which is that the financial remuneration that's given to the engineers and the business people that are behind these software products, you could think of that as the reward that the machines are giving to the humans in order to get the humans to do the things that nurture and develop the machines. Okay. And so, from that perspective, that's a little bit less value laden, right? And it assigns too much agency to the machines. The machines are not, of course, there's no deliberateness in this, but there's never deliberateness. I mean, in a good understanding of a Darwinian evolution, nothing is deliberate, right? Everything happens through this kind of feedback of mutation and survival, and the incentive functions that come into play are incentive functions that facilitate propagation of the techniques. And the fact is that making profits for people is a way to incentivize people to develop the machines in a particular way, right? And so you get this feedback effect where people will just develop software and products that make money because it enables them to continue to develop software and products that make money.
Right.
Kind of a self-fulfilling thing, right? And we see this in the open source community, where often open source software, which often is by design meant to not make money, often struggles in competition with commercial software because it doesn't have this incentive-driven feedback loop, that it doesn't nurture the people who develop the software in such a way that enables the further development of that software, right? So this perspective is trying to put a less of a value judgment on the whole process, and try to understand the mechanisms of it. Because I think if we can understand the mechanisms, we have a better chance of being able to at least nudge those mechanisms. So, I talked about the fact that we don't really have control over the process. That doesn't mean that we should just give up and let whatever happens. I think that's a bad choice. I think we do need regulation, for example. I think software systems need to be regulated. If we don't regulate them, I think democracy is going to collapse. Right? We need mechanisms to protect democracy. But the question is, how should we regulate them? And if we try to come up with regulations based on a misunderstanding of how the process works, we're likely to come up with ineffective mechanisms. So, for example, I think that the privacy laws that have been passed recently in the US and in Europe are pretty ineffective. And I think that they're ineffective in large part because they're based on this this principle of digital creationism, that they think that if you just get the corporations to do the right thing and disclose all their incentives, then good outcomes will result. But it doesn't work that way. If it's not a digital creationism sort of process, then basing laws on the premise that it is may not accomplish the goals that you're after. Okay, so I think the key idea here is that we really need to understand these processes in much more depth, understand the complexities and the challenges, behind regulating them. It's not going to be easy to regulate them. I mean, Darwinian processes, evolutionary processes that are rapidly mutating, which this is certainly one of, are very hard to predict. We can't see very far into the future what's going to happen. And so, coming up with regulations to try to prevent bad outcomes is very challenging in a situation where it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen. But if we don't understand the processes, then we're very unlikely to come up with effective regulations.
It's such a complex issue. Do you have any guidance for organizations that are trying to be responsible? They're trying to reduce bias. They're trying to make sure their algorithms are equitable and helpful. But to your point, mutations happen. AIs are going to try to operate in a way that's going to be efficient. And so there might be some things that happen as they evolve. And I'm just kind of curious, like, what are ways to be responsible and also quick to adapt to the changes that are happening?
I think I think that's a wonderful question, and it's not an easy one to answer. But I guess the way that I would come at the answer is that I think that everyone involved in technology development and in the business of technology needs to be very culturally attuned. And the fact is that technology has become very deeply embedded in human culture, and it's changing the way we run our lives. I mean, I certainly see this in our kids, where people's online persona may be really quite different from their in-person persona, and they may identify more strongly with their online persona than with their in-person persona. And to the extent that people that they've met online, they don't really want to meet in person, because it's almost like a different person that's going to emerge in person from the one that's online. And I think that this tight integration of technology with culture needs to be better understood both by the technologists and by the humanists who are involved in, or who are able to figure out cultural phenomena and able to analyze cultural phenomena. And right now, I think there's a huge barrier between these two groups of people. And I think that to some degree, educators like myself are to blame for this. Right? We have these intensive engineering and computer science programs that really don't include a lot of humanities. And so our students are not getting equipped with the level of sophistication that I think is necessary to understand the nuanced interactions between technology and human culture. And I think that, understanding those nuanced relationships is going to require kind of a new breed of people, people that I would call, have some blend of being a humanist and a technologist. This is part of the reason that I was so enthused about this, am so enthused about this workshop that I still hope will happen in Vienna, is its focus on what they call digital humanism, which is really about bringing these two worlds together, the humanist perspective with the technological perspective. Many people on the technology side, many of my colleagues try to oversimplify this problem. So, for example, the engineering and computer science programs in the U.S. are mostly accredited by an accreditation board. And one of the requirements of the accreditation board is that all students have to take a course in ethics, right? And so there's an assumption here that there's a silver bullet, right? Which is that if we just get all the engineers to behave ethically, we'll get good outcomes. But I don't think that's actually true. I think you can have all engineers behaving ethically and still not get good outcomes. I think the interactions are much more complex and are not just about the individual participants behaving ethically. So I think that one of the things that I would like to see, and I think that to some degree we do see, one of the more effective than regulation is public sentiment. right? When people get fed up with effects like the filter bubbles of Facebook and walk away from Facebook, if that puts a certain pressure on these companies, and I think that there's every individual, I think, has a responsibility to keep that pressure up. But as individuals, it's a little bit hard to have much of an impact, right? If I walk away from Facebook, it has zero impact, right? But on the other hand, if the influencers change public opinion about a way that a certain technology is being used and is manipulating people, then that public opinion can have a fairly strong effect on the further development of the technology. And I think we need to accentuate that effect. And I think that people who are on the business side of this need to be extremely sensitive to this. I think to a large degree they are, but they often get caught completely by surprise when there's an adverse reaction, right? Like Google's project that created this, gave this demo, which I talk about in my book, of I'm trying to, the name of it escapes me at the moment. Duplex, I think, is what they called it, which was an AI that could make phone calls for you, for example, to arrange. And in their demo, they had someone who called a restaurant. The AI calls a restaurant and tries to book a table for 4 people by interacting with a human. And the AI was injecting a lot of ums and you betchas and kind of nuances in the voice to sound a lot more human, including this tendency of upspeak, which is sort of raising
Interesting.
the tone at the end. And it was scarily effective, right? This AI. And Google was caught completely by surprise at the reaction of horror in the media to this thing. Why would they be creating a technology whose sole purpose is to fool people? And they said, oh, yeah, maybe that, oh, gee, we didn't think of it before. They were just caught completely by surprise. And that sort of lack of sensitivity and lack of understanding of the cultural interaction of the technology is fairly pervasive among technologists. And I think we need to fix it. So one of my goals in my book, unfortunately, in some ways I'd like technologists to read my book. For the most part, a lot of the technologists I interact with don't read books like this. So it, maybe barking up the wrong tree, but nevertheless, I think we need technologists to get much more attuned to this cultural interaction between technology and humans, and they need to engage in a much deeper way and not try to oversimplify it as just an ethics problem.
Yeah, I think that speaks to just the importance of data science teams, engineering teams, technology teams, to have a diverse group of people working on those projects, having diverse backgrounds, diverse perspectives. Those are all like super important to help to detect potential bias, potential problems with, right?
Absolutely. I mean, diversity is an enormous help with this kind of thing. I think that 10 to 15 years ago, at Berkeley, our technological ecosystem was, all male, pretty much, with a very small percentage of females, and a ethnically diverse group of people, but not culturally diverse. And I think that that's changed. And I've seen real progress in this dimension, and I see it also changing how the technology is being developed. That to some degree there's a slow but steady shift in the focus of research that is more accepting of a broader range of perspectives than you would have seen a few years ago. I think there's this sort of old-fashioned view of technology that it's all about that technology developers are just trying to solve a well-defined problem in an optimal way. Just optimize this thing so that it's done in the most efficient way possible. I don't think that is a very good description of what we're doing these days with technology. Most of what we do is not about optimization at all. It's about creating whole new mechanisms that deeply engage humans, and that's not an optimization problem, right? That has such a strong humanist side to it that I think it takes a different kind of person to really do that effectively. It takes people who, do read a lot outside their discipline, who are interested in history and philosophy and uh, linguistics and literature, and that's not that hasn't been the traditional population among computer scientists and engineers, and I think it needs to be much more.
Yeah, you think about, as you were saying, like even the college campuses, those areas are usually the opposite sides of the campus. Like the humanities are over
Yeah,
here, right?
yeah, yeah. There's a huge cultural gap. I mean, I've had colleagues who who will state on we have very lively email discussions, and they'll lament the fact that the students have to waste time with these American cultures courses, and they'll call them they use the term these are Mickey Mouse courses, and what they're doing is they're expressing their ignorance. They're
Mhm.
broadcasting their ignorance. In fact, they don't they don't understand that the intellectual depth that is going on elsewhere on campus. And I'm seeing a lot less of that these days, right? This is, I think, it was very prevalent, 20 years ago. Nowadays, most people would be profoundly embarrassed by such a statement. But 20 years ago, these guys, and they were all guys, were not embarrassed by those kinds of statements.
Dr. Lee, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us on Data Talk. Dr. Lee is the author of the book, The Co-Evolution, The Entwined Futures of Humans and Machines. For those that want to get in touch with you, connect with you, they might have questions after hearing what you've shared today. What's the best way for them to reach out to you?
I am very open to email. It's the by far the best way to reach me. I always respond. Um, And my email is easy to find, despite my very generic last name, Lee. If you Google Edward Lee at Berkeley, it'll take you to my webpage, which has my email address on it.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for being on Data Talk.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for organizing this and for a stimulating set of questions.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Data Talk. We share out new episodes every single week, and you can find the full catalog of previous episodes as well as YouTube videos by going to the Experian news blog. The URL is just experian.com/datatalk. And as always, we love hearing from our community. So if you have any comments or suggestions for future shows, please reach out. You can find us on Twitter at Experian Data Lab, or you can always reach out to me directly. My email is michael.delgado@experian.com. Take care, and we'll chat next week.